Get ready for success. Leadership Strategies for Women is a show dedicated to providing practical and valuable strategies for emerging women leaders of today. It's your time to get inspired, motivated, and challenged to achieve your vision for success. And now, here's leadership speaker and coach, Ellie Nieves.
This is the Leadership Strategies for Women podcast, and I am your host, Ellie Nieves. I'm the founder and president of Leadership Strategies for Women, where I develop seminars and webinars to help high-achieving women show up, speak up, and step up in their careers. To learn more, you can visit my website at leadershipstrategiesforwomen.com, or you can follow the Leadership Strategies for Women page on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Here to talk to us today about leadership levers is Dianna Jones. Dianna Jones is a trusted and experienced leadership advisor, executive coach, and author. She brings over 30 years of experience in leaders' behavioral change, working alongside public and private sector executives and professionals as they reshape their relationships to achieve exceptional business results. Dianna, welcome to the Leadership Strategies for Women podcast.
Thank you, Ellie. It's really lovely to be here with you.
So, Dianna, share with us a little bit about your background and even tell us what part of the world that you're dialing in from today.
I'm dialing in from Wellington, New Zealand. So it's a very odd hour, very early in the morning at the moment, but it's very good to talk with you. And we're just entering our summer. So yesterday was the first day of our summer, which is, I think, slightly different from where you are.
Yes, it's very cold here in New York.
Yes, I adore your city. Yeah. A bit about my background. I, oddly enough, was originally a physical educator, and then I taught at a university to a master's degree program here in Wellington, New Zealand. And I got very interested in the area of theory and practice, like conceptual ideas and how do they work in practice. And that led me to wanting to understand a lot about how groups worked. So I was what was called the academic supervisor of master's degree students. And I'd often be in organizations and the leaders would ask me, what do you notice? Why do you think people are stressed? And naturally, I was quite opinionated. And so I'd let them know what I thought. And I thought, why don't I find out a lot more about this? And so I trained in a particular area of psychodrama, which is the content. It's not so much intellectual content, it's people's lives. And through that, I learned, after thousands of hours in groups, I learned quite a lot about how groups worked and the nature of relationships. And I came very intrigued with formal structures and then the informal network of relationships that actually get going in organizations that create who works with who gets on with who, and who you solve problems with, who you confide in. All of those things began to really intrigue me because I found that the formal structure is kind of how organizations are supposed to work, but actually they don't often. It might be the decision structure, but it's actually the relationships among people that become very important. And that's what my latest book, Leadership Levers, is all about.
Wow, that's fascinating work. And I'm sure that as you were developing in this area, it wasn't completely linear. You probably faced some challenges right along the way. What are some of those challenges that you faced as you were striving to attain your goals?
Well, one of the challenges is there's this real fallacy in organizations that, particularly with leaders, and this affects women leaders enormously because they don't necessarily gravitate this way. And it's the idea that to be a leader, you need to be logical and rational. And my position wasn't to do with that at all. I could see that leaders developed relationships and people liked working with them if they were easy to trust, if they were very interested in their staff's development, if they were visionary, if they were clear about expectations, if they were available. And that's got nothing to do with logic and rationality. And so I was working in an area that was a little bit fringe, but what occurred in New Zealand was that they realized that a lot of leaders weren't inspirational. And so that became my niche in developing my business. And the challenges are, I think, they're twofold when you're working in business. It's developing yourself. So I invested a lot of my own professional development, but you also need to develop your business. So every now and again, I had to dramatically change my business model. And because I was all of the time, I've been known for bespoke services, as opposed to often when you work in large corporates, they want a one-size-fits-all training program. And I have not done that, and I've chosen not to do that. And it's been fantastic for me that I've gone that way. It's meant I do have a niche, and I tend to work with mostly chief executives here in New Zealand. So that's become very satisfying.
That's wonderful. That's great. So ultimately, why should we, as women leaders, be thinking about how we shape our relationships in business?
Well, firstly, it's quite a natural thing for many women leaders to do this. And particularly to really rely on the informal network of relationships. So probably I did a lot of work with the Centre for Creative Leadership in the late 80s and early 90s, and where those authors were writing about the glass ceiling. And of course, that's been smashed completely. It's kind of hardly a concept anymore. But in those days, it was very difficult for women to take senior leadership positions. Like you can see it in so many women leaders, both politically and in businesses right throughout the States and all around the world. But relationships are a natural thing for many women. They just find them easy, and they find them, so they've got an asset essentially. And my encouragement is to keep using that asset. So there was what was called the old boys network. And so that was usually related to how men had either been to school together or shared a common interest in rugby or something, or whatever or football, or whatever the sport of the time was. And so it was a very restrictive way that groups formed. But that's where a lot of the business got done outside of meetings, would be these informal interactions. And so women have had to learn what their networks are and how they relate. And of course, it's on much more depth of relationships when people form connections around shared experience, particularly, rather than just say content. So I find that women, when I'm talking with women, they will easily relate to something in their personal life. Now, whether women are parents or not parents, that's beginning of common ground. But there's also a lot of in-depth experience, like people who have come from other countries, migrated from other countries to come. Like that is often a shared experience. Growing up with one, like a solo parent, is another shared experience. It's actually quite meaningful for women leaders, and it affects how they approach the way they lead. So those are the areas that people can connect, and that creates connections between women and men. So my emphasis is around finding those experiences. So often when I'm with a group, the way I will help the relationships develop, I might say, what was the experience, and where were you? How old were you when you first realized you were a leader? And that takes people to all parts of their lives. And when they share that, people get quite a sense of knowing about that individual. It builds connections rapidly.
I love that. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do in the workplace, is to build some of those informal relationships. And when I often coach women, they always tell me that they don't like networking. They think networking is something that is not authentic. Yet it is a pathway to building those informal relationships that you're discussing that can really have those dramatic effects on business results. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, I really agree that I find networking a pain. Like if you're standing around and you've got a drink and there's all these kind of formal groups, it's so painful, really. I find it, and not very helpful. Everyone's trying to push their business. But what I'm talking about is doing this during business meetings, so that people introduce themselves and connect with one another around things that where there's common ground. So if you start a meeting and you know, like people might be together for the first time, it might be some, you know, working in the area of innovation or processes to change, or just people getting together, might begin by saying, what are 3 qualities that you bring to this meeting that will help us really resolve what we've got in front of us? And you've got a much more lively way of interacting. And it's those expressions and communications and sort of like self-disclosures that really help people connect. And it's I don't call it networking, I call it developing relationships, getting to know one another. Yeah.
That's a great distinction. Thank you for sharing that. So why do we need, in the process of developing these relationships, to stop aiming for consensus?
Well, I think consensus is it's completely unrealistic. But what people can agree on is a shared direction. That's the core of it. But if you ask in any group, like what might be a decision a company would be making, you know, should we invest in ABC, yes or no? If you use something like a continuum, a line from no to yes, and you ask people to, like you can ask them verbally, but what I'll often do is ask them to actually stand on the line and about where they are yes or no, and you'll see the spread right across the line. And if you ask people like, how come you're there? They'll let you know what would get you to yes. And so you find out what the roadblocks are. So most decisions are much more nuanced than just everyone agreeing, oh, this is a good idea. I mean, if that happened, I think we'd have an enormous amount of progress in our organization. But I notice so many people find it very difficult, and they make decisions that a lot of people haven't said what they thought. They haven't brought out their reservations. They haven't brought out their innovative ideas that they've got, or quite different ways of doing things. And so I believe it's completely unrealistic to go for consensus, but you can certainly have shared vision and a shared direction. But people are bringing quite different things to delivering results.
In your book, you talk about developing intimacy, right? And when we think about relationships, we think about intimacy, but when we think about it in the workplace, it doesn't always jive with many of us. But what are some of the 4 factors that you address in your book that influence a leader's capacity for intimacy?
Well, what I talk about is it's a very unusual thing, because I know a lot of leaders, because of this rational, logical thing, people think to be a leader, they've got to be a leader, but actually their personal qualities are very influential, and that's their capacity for empathy, compassion, relationships, ability to be firm, decisive, a ruthless decision maker. All those qualities become very important, and for leaders, it's not just their knowledge or their expertise that makes them a leader, it's their capacity to have a vision and really help people achieve the vision. So when you think of leadership in that way, and the way people get to know one another, so you have that professional identity, the leader, but actually the way people get to know one another is to self-disclose. And so that means saying something personal. So you asked me about my background, and I let you know I taught at a university for a number of years. So that gives you an idea about me. And then I might talk about what motivated me. You asked me some of my challenges. So that gets into what's quite private territory. And so when leaders talk about both personal things and what's previously been private, that lets people know them more. But it's not just the leader's role. It's my view that everybody in the organization needs to do that. But it's also deciding, in the book, I also talk about levels of self-disclosure. And so there's just a simple level of self-disclosure, which is something like when I work with leaders in their executive presence, some of the leaders I know are very ungiving. And so they won't use the word I. They won't say, I really like what you've done there. or I think you've got an exceptional capacity to really hone in on what the significant factors are and express those simply. Now, those are simple self-disclosure, and that self-disclosure is, I like that. Now, some leaders find that so difficult to be positive and acknowledge great contributions. And then there's the next level of self-disclosure where the leader begins to talk about some of the challenges they've got. So they might say something like, I just find in a group we're going round and round in circles, and I feel quite frustrated that we haven't got a forward movement. And I find that in my leadership team. So if I'm talking with my peers, I might say, what advice can you give me to move forward? So you're not coming across as some perfect being. You're kind of really inviting other people in. Right. And that creates relationships. And then the third is like really deep self-disclosure. And one of the examples I use in the book was one of the leaders I was working with was in quite a substantial group, and they were looking at really shifting their culture. And she actually said, from now on, you won't hear me talking about other people behind their backs. What I will do, I'm open to you to come to me with any of your concerns. So that's quite a deep level of self-disclosure, which discloses also a fallibility. Now, for many leaders, that's both personal, it's very personal, and it would have been private. So people might have known that about that particular leader, but she was the one to bring it out. So I talk at a lot of depth in the book about these levels of self-disclosure and the way to create intimacy. And the thing with intimacy in organizations, and where it's gone terribly wrong, particularly for women, that often people have had these private and personal conversations over a glass of wine, over dinner, or at parties and so on, and it gets into the wrong territory. So I'm saying let's have these conversations based on very wise questions that are relevant to the group. And when you've got criteria like that, like what was the first experience that you had where you realized you're a leader, something like that, taps into personal and private experiences. And I've used that in a number of the programs and work that I've done, and the stories are just magnificent. I would tell you some of the stories, but read my book. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So Dianna, what is next for you personally?
Well, I'm still continuing my work, which is mostly with chief executives and the leadership teams at a national level in New Zealand, where there's significant change. Of course, we're coming, like many other countries and states, we're coming out of the pandemic now. So over 90% of the New Zealand population have had their first vaccination, and in about 3 weeks, those people would have had their second vaccination. So that's kind of creating a new sense of freedom. There's enormous business stimulus in the country about to happen. So I'll be involved with some of the groups that are working with that as they devise strategy, bring new groups together, reform, repurpose themselves, work out what their priorities are, because anyone who had a strategic plan would have completely gone out the window. And the second thing I'm doing is really working with a number of organisations, really helping them reconnect and refresh the informal network of relationships in their organisation, because as people have worked online, they've lost a lot of those happenstance connections with one another. And many people have had quite profound experiences during the pandemic within their families and their friendship networks. And there's a need to really acknowledge that and move forward together. Yeah.
So how can our listeners get in touch with you?
Well, my website is very simple. It's dianna-jones.com. And my book is Leadership Levers, Releasing the Power of Relationships for Exceptional Participation, Alignment and Team Results. So, and my email is diannaj@dianna-jones.com. It'd be great to hear from everyone.
Oh, Dianna, thank you so much. You've given us some very unique insights on how we can build relationships in the workplace and how we can grow as leaders. You've given us some really great perspective.
Thank you, Ellie. It's been great to be with you and your listeners. It's very good. Thank
Great.
you.
Great. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, God bless.